morning. This morning I want to talk about Mary, the mother of Jesus. And I'm going to get into the subject in a rather roundabout way, so bear with me. I want to start with papal infallibility. Papal infallibility is based on the belief that the Pope is considered the successor to St. Peter, to whom, in Roman Catholic teaching, Jesus gave the keys to the kingdom and the power to bind and loose. So any infallible teaching comes only from the Pope, either alone or with the College of Bishops. And second, the Pope must be speaking ex cathedra, that is, in his official capacity as shepherd and teacher of all Catholic Christians. And he is defining a doctrine concerning faith or morals that is to be held by the whole church. Those conditions eliminate most of the teachings that come out of the Vatican from being considered infallible. Also, what many people don't know is that the formal doctrine of infallibility itself wasn't defined dogmatically until the First Vatican Council in 1869 to 70, called by Pope Pius IX. Since 1869, only 3 doctrines have been declared as infallible. The first was the doctrine itself, in some respects formalizing what had been assumed in some cases in the centuries prior. The second doctrine actually preceded Vatican I, but it was proclaimed by Pope Pius IX, and therefore was considered infallible retroactively. It is the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, the assertion that Mary was free of original sin from the moment of her conception. This was important theologically, by the way, so that Jesus could also be born free from original sin. We can talk about this later. The third declaration actually was made in the lifetime of some members of this congregation. In 1950, the doctrine of the Assumption of Mary into heaven, body and soul, was declared infallible by another Pope, Pius XII. The point in this brief historical introduction is that the 2 primary doctrines declared infallible by the Roman Catholic Church were about Mary, the primary figure of our gospel reading this morning, and always the subject of the 4th Sunday of Advent. They thus point to the importance of Mary in Christian teaching, an importance that goes back to the beginning, of course, but not without controversy. There were questions, not only about the virgin birth, but also whether or not Mary remained perpetually a virgin. Assertions of Mary's perpetual virginity, as well as miraculous conception, date back to the 2nd century, most notably in a fascinating document known as the Proto-Evangelium of James, which also provides the names of Mary's parents and the idea that Joseph was an old man. Another important Marian discussion in early Christianity was really a part of a Christological argument. Could Mary actually give birth to God, since Jesus was both God and human? The theological answer was yes, giving Mary the title in Greek of Theotokos, best translated in English as God-bearer. The Latin translation, Mater Dei, of Theotokos, became the more familiar in English, Mother of God. Centuries later came the debate over the role of Mary in the mystery of the redemption of all peoples, represented in her title, co-redeemer or co-redemptrix. Such doctrine, by the way, never became official. And it was based on her free consent to giving birth to the Redeemer. While all of those doctrines have theological roots in the Gospels, they are post-biblical developments, and developments that, for the most part, were set aside by the Protestant Reformation. In the words of one commentator, Mary was collateral damage in the Reformation. And as with many things the Reformers set aside, much was lost. It's not my intention this morning to go any further into the theology surrounding Mary. I've simply wanted to highlight how much of how we think about her from the beginning to the end of her earthly life has developed since the Gospels were written. And this highlights, of course, how important Mary has been throughout Christian history. Indeed, to return to the doctrine of papal infallibility, beliefs about Mary are so important that disagreeing with either of the Marian doctrines, Immaculate Conception or bodily assumption, puts Catholics on the road to damnation. Disagreements about Mary, however, go as far back as the Gospels themselves. The first Gospel written, Mark, portrays Mary pretty unfavorably. She seems to accept the crowd's evaluation of Jesus as deranged, or the scribe's characterization of Jesus as demon-possessed. She is seemingly not included by Jesus as a member of his true family. When told that his mothers and brothers were asking about him, Jesus' statement that a prophet is not without honor among his own family and in his own house would include his mother. The Gospel of Matthew is a bit more favorable. It has those two Markan stories, but doesn't contain the references to Jesus' family. Matthew, of course, tells the story of Jesus' birth, his birth to the Virgin Mary. But it is in Matthew's story that Joseph decides to end the engagement, an action forestalled because of a dream Joseph has that tells of who the child will be. Apparently, he had to tell Mary that piece of information. In other words, in Matthew's gospel, much of what is told about Mary really relates to Joseph. The picture of Jesus' mother is mixed in John's gospel. She does, of course, believe he has power of some sort at the wedding at Cana. And John includes her among the witnesses to the crucifixion. But throughout the gospel, Jesus' mother is never given a name. It's in the Gospel of Luke that we get a very different, a quite positive picture of Mary, beginning with the episode immediately preceding what we heard this morning. That is, Mary's conversation with the angel Gabriel. The angel tells Mary she will bear Jesus. Mary, according to Luke, was perplexed and afraid and doubted that such a thing could happen. But Gabriel assures her that the miracle would be of God's doing, just as Elizabeth, thought barren, would soon give birth to a son. Gabriel's assurance leads to Mary's significant act of faith. I am the Lord's servant. Let it be with me just as you have said. It is Luke who tells us that Mary gets up and hurries to see Elizabeth. She hurries, as some commentators have pointed out, alone and at a distance of some 80 miles, perhaps to confirm Gabriel's message. There's no message in Luke, by the way, of any hint of scandal. And upon arrival, both predictions are affirmed. The child Elizabeth's carrying, John, leaps in her womb, and Elizabeth and John recognizes the child Mary carries. And Elizabeth then proclaims Mary's status as blessed and confirms her act of faith. Happy is she who believed that the Lord will fulfill the promises he made to her. With that confirmation in hand, Mary sings the great song we now call the Magnificat, beginning with a cry of joy. With all my heart, I glorify the Lord. In the depths of who I am, I rejoice in God my Savior, because the Mighty One has done great things for me. It is Luke who tells us that after giving birth, it is Mary that wraps Jesus in swaddling clothes and lays him in a manger. It was from that manger that the shepherds left and told of what they'd seen, causing Mary to treasure all these words and ponder them in her heart. When Jesus was taken to the temple, the aged Simeon's assertion that he, Simeon, could die happily, having seen the promised Savior, amazed both Joseph and Mary. But it was only to Mary that he revealed the full impact of what Jesus would do, as well as the impact his life would have on her. A sword will pierce your innermost being too. Luke tells us of Mary, the mother, scolding the 12-year-old Jesus for lagging behind in Jerusalem to converse with the scholars in the temple. When he responds that he ought to be in God's house, but then returns home, Mary cherished every word in her heart. While there may be some uncertainty as to whether Mary was one of the daughters of Jerusalem who wept for Jesus as he was led to be crucified, or was present at the cross, or at the tomb, it is Luke in the book of Acts who writes that Mary was still with the other disciples after the crucifixion and resurrection. Mary, in Luke's gospel, is a believer from the very beginning to the end and beyond. Luke brings us into the joys and sorrows of Jesus' life through the person of Mary. In many respects, then, Mary becomes the prototype for any disciple. She says, yes, be it unto me according to your word, despite the seeming impossibility of what God is asking. To return to questions of doctrine, I admit that I have some issues with the infallible assertions of immaculate conception and bodily assumption. But I also have to admit that I am very much drawn to the ideas that lie behind the unofficial doctrine of co-redemptrix. And that is because if Mary hadn't said yes to Gabriel, if she hadn't had the faith to accept the promise of an unknown but holy future that would lead to our redemption, then I have to wonder if we would be here today. In Mary's yes to God's future, in her celebration of God's promises to be made real in her life, we have hope. And we have an example. I mentioned a bit earlier that at least one commentator thought Mary to be collateral damage in the Reformation. Well, not to all reformers. Both in name and attitude, she was clearly in the mind and heart of the 18th century Dutch Reformed hymn writer Gerhard Tersteegen, whose last verse of his hymn, God himself is with us, prays to the Spirit, come, abide within me, let my soul, like Mary, be thine earthly sanctuary. May we then, like Mary, say yes to God's future, however uncertain we might think it, that we become a fit sanctuary for Christ when he comes. Amen.